Okay, this is Josh Strain, and this is my final project for biochemistry. I'm going to do my best to keep this short and succinct while covering everything. And the way I'm going to do this, I'm going to give a brief overview of the whole pathway. Then I'm going to talk about rate-limiting steps and enzymes, etc., how they are stimulated and or inhibited. We're going to look at the whole thing, but I am going to focus on the fasting state for each pathway. Okay, first pathway, glycolysis. So, brief overview. We have glucose in the blood entering the cell, becomes glucose 6-phosphate. Then we have fructose 6-phosphate down to fructose 1,6-bisphosphate. That splits off, becomes DHAP and G3P. Now, these progress through the rest of the pathway to PEP, phosphoenolpyruvate, and eventually to pyruvate. So, rate-limiting steps of glycolysis. We have glucose in the blood. Gets taken into the cell, becomes phosphorylated by either hexokinase or glucokinase if we're talking about the liver. They need magnesium to do their job. Now glucose 6-phosphate is inside the cell. The reason this is rate limiting is because this cannot leave the cell as it is. So it's going to tend to progress through the rest of the pathway. So we have this becoming fructose 6-phosphate. Fructose 6-phosphate becomes 1,6-bisphosphate. Now this is another rate limiting step, phosphofructokinase. Because this is not a reversible enzymatic process, once we get fructose 1,6-bisphosphate, it's going to be committed to the rest of the pathway. So for this step, we need ATP, but ATP is also an inhibitor. So if the ATP is being used up, it's not going to be here to inhibit the enzyme. Now, this also needs magnesium to do its job, just like the first rate limiting step. Now we have fructose 1,6-bisphosphate, travels through the rest of the pathway till we get to PEP, another rate limiting step, because again, this is not reversible process. So PEP is converted to pyruvate by pyruvate kinase, also needs magnesium, and we're now creating ATP from ADP. So these are the rate limiting steps: hexokinase or glucokinase, phosphofructokinase, pyruvate kinase. Now, glycolysis as a whole, stimulated by glucose concentration in the blood. So if the glucose is in the blood and coming into the cell, it's going to stimulate glycolysis. Hexokinase or glucokinase, which need magnesium, are also going to stimulate this to happen because they are making the glucose 6-phosphate, which cannot get back out. So it's going to likely tend towards this pathway. Glucokinase needs high glucose because we're talking about the liver, and the liver doesn't want to hog the glucose, so if there's not a lot, it's going to let other cells have it. Now, phosphofructokinase 1, activated by AMP, which is characteristic of low energy, and it's also activated by fructose 2,6-bisphosphate, which is different than 1,6-bisphosphate. It's a separate thing that's created from the fructose 6-phosphate, which is not part of glycolysis itself, except it acts as an activator for phosphofructokinase 1. Now, this step is inhibited by high energy because that's the body saying, hey, we've got energy. We don't need to keep doing this right now. And the fructose 6-phosphate or the glucose 6-phosphate can go and do other things. And it is also inhibited by citrate, a result of the TCA cycle, which is also a signifier of high energy. Now down here, pyruvate kinase activated by fructose 1,6-bisphosphate. So when we have a lot of this enzyme is going to be activated because remember, this is the committing step to the rest of the pathway. So if we've got a lot of this, we need to activate this to make sure all this goes through into pyruvate and the TCA cycle. Okay, inhibitors of glycolysis. Glucose 6-phosphate inhibits hexokinase. So this basically, if there's a buildup of glucose 6-phosphate, means it's not needed in glycolysis or other places. So that acts as its own regulator and blocks hexokinase from making more of it, bringing more glucose into the cell. Phosphofructokinase, we said, is inhibited by ATP and citrate because they are markers of high energy, and we're saying to the body we don't need energy when there's already a lot, so we can stop with this regulatory step, just stop it, do some other things with this stuff. And pyruvate kinase, we said, is inhibited by the ATP that it makes, again, because that's a marker of high energy. So when we're in the fasting state, these inhibitors are probably not going to be working so much because we want to make energy, not necessarily using dietary glucose because we're fasting, but we want to use these other intermediates from different pathways to go through this and continue to make energy. So in the fasting state, all of these are going to be activated and stimulated because low energy is what does that. Now, a couple quick things about this. We need magnesium for various steps of this pathway. Very, very important if you want to have glycolysis happen. Also, some things that can inhibit glycolysis. We have some heavy metals, specifically mercury and arsenic, which will inhibit glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate dehydrogenase in this step here, which is important because these two can come from other pathways as well. So if this isn't happening, you're not only getting the energy from this part of glycolysis, but from other pathways that are sending these intermediaries into this process. And fluoride also will block the enzyme enolase in this reaction right here. Now, one last thing about glycolysis, it is not necessarily dependent on insulin or glucagon, but it is dependent on glucose concentration around the cell, but it's not directly stimulated by either insulin or glucagon itself. Okay, brief overview of the TCA cycle. So we came from glycolysis, we made 2-pyruvate. Now, pyruvate will enter the mitochondria against its concentration gradient, become acetyl-CoA through the pyruvate dehydrogenase complex. Acetyl-CoA then proceeds to become citrate, isocitrate, alpha-ketoglutarate, succinyl-CoA, succinate, fumarate, malate, oxaloacetate, and the whole thing keeps going. Now, these other things here can also become acetyl-CoA and feed into the TCA cycle. So, rate-limiting steps of the TCA cycle. Here we go, pyruvate dehydrogenase complex. First of all, we need a lot of pyruvate out here and not a lot in the mitochondria to make this work. So the pyruvate's going to want to come in and become acetyl-CoA. Pyruvate dehydrogenase complex is inhibited by NADH, which is a result of many of these steps in here. So if there's a buildup of NADH, it's not going on to be used in the electron transport chain. So it's going to be hanging out and it's going to say, whoa, PDC, you can chill out. We don't need any more energy right now. And also acetyl-CoA, which is a result of the PDC, acts as an inhibitor for the same reason. A lot of buildup of this means it's not going through this pathway, meaning we don't need energy on the other side, meaning we can take a chill pill, pyruvate, you can go and do some other things. So here we go. The other inhibitor here, citrate. Now we saw in glycolysis, citrate can block phosphofructokinase 1 for the same reason, because we get a buildup here of citrate. It's saying, well, guys, chill out. We don't need to keep going with this. Citrate will also block citrate synthase for the same reason, because citrate, this is a reversible reaction right here, isocitrate. So this reaction is not reversible. So if this is stopped, we get a buildup of isocitrate, which will then go back to citrate, which will signal the blocking of PFK1 and citrate synthase. Now, citrate becomes isocitrate through aconitase, which needs iron to activate it. So if you're using iron in a molecule, you want to have some glutathione around to help keep that thing working correctly. Now, isocitrate, as we said, this is a irreversible reaction, isocitrate dehydrogenase to alpha-ketoglutarate. Now, this is stimulated by ADP and also by calcium if we're talking about muscle cells, because that's an indicator that we are doing work and need to keep this thing going. So let's keep it going, ADP, calcium. It is blocked, however, by NADH, which is one of its results. So again, if the NADH is building up in this process, that means it's not being used in the ETC, so it's going to block this, and the isocitrate can go back to citrate and do these other things. Now, alpha-ketoglutarate, we have another big step here. Again, we're making more NADH, which again is its own regulator in this step. Now, this step also requires B1, B2, B3, B5, ALA to happen, so you want to get your B vitamins, your healthy fats, for this to happen. Now, this is going to go to succinyl-CoA, which we will see again later, I believe. It also goes to heme synthesis. So succinyl-CoA becomes succinate, becomes fumarate. Here's where we get some FAD for the future electron transport chain. Now, this becomes malate. Malate can go and block fatty acid oxidation, because if we're doing all this, we don't need to oxidize fats for energy. So this will go and block fatty acid oxidation, because we don't need to do that when we're doing this. And this will also help to start gluconeogenesis, which we will see later on. Now, malate dehydrogenase also inhibited by NADH. So that's a recurring thing here. We have NADH being a huge inhibitor of this process because that signifies that it is not being used in the electron transport chain, so we don't need to keep doing all this. So the TCA cycle stimulated by pyruvate dehydrogenase complex and the concentration gradient of pyruvate itself. Now it needs NAD+, CoAsh, B1, 2, 3, 5, ALA. It is also stimulated by ADP and calcium, again, coming into the muscle cell saying, hey, we're working, let's get this thing going. Isocitrate, we talked about being stimulated by ADP and calcium as well. Isocitrate dehydrogenase, and the pyruvate concentration gradient is also one of the things that starts this off. Now, inhibitions of the TCA cycle, this we said inhibited by the NADH and the acetyl-CoA, signifying a buildup, and we don't need to keep going. Citrate synthase is inhibited by citrate. And all of these other things, isocitrate dehydrogenase, alpha-ketoglutarate dehydrogenase, malate dehydrogenase, inhibited by the molecules of NADH, again, signifying a buildup. We don't need to keep going with this. In the fasting state, what we're going to get is, so in the fasting state, what's going to happen, we're not going to necessarily want to inhibit this because we want energy production to keep happening. However, we don't have dietary glucose coming in necessarily, but all these other things can become acetyl-CoA. So in the fasting state, we're going to be using our fatty acids, in which case malate is going to be used up and not blocking fatty acid oxidation, because that would be way counterproductive. So fatty acids can come in, ketones can come in, amino acids in worst case scenario can come in, become acetyl-CoA. This is all going to be happening in the fasting state, and we're not wanting inhibition to happen because we want this to keep going, again, from these other substrates, not necessarily dietary glucose. Okay, the electron transport chain. So we had a lot of NADH and H+. coming from the TCA cycle. So we talked about it being used in the electron transport chain, and if it's not, that's going to back up and inhibit the TCA cycle. But if it is being used, here's what's happening. NADH transferring an electron to complex 1. Now complex 1 spits out into the intermembrane space 4 hydrogen ions. Going to transfer the electron again to CoQ10. Here we have succinate dehydrogenase, which is its own step in the TCA cycle, produces FAD2H as part of this process to help move the electron along. With CoQ10 to complex 3, requires iron. Now again, we have iron. We're going to need some strong antioxidant material to prevent this from being damaged and to keep it working correctly. So the electron, this complex here, spits out into the intermembrane space again, 4 hydrogen ions. Now the electron continues cytochrome C. We need some copper to make this happen, to get it to complex 4. We're using some oxygen and some more hydrogen, and we're getting water. And we're also getting 2 hydrogen ions over here. Now that's going to build up the hydrogen concentration in the intermembrane space, and it's going to go through for 3 reasons. We have an electrical gradient, we also have a concentration gradient, and we have a pH gradient because these are positively charged. We're going to want to balance that out. They're going to go through the ATP synthase and create ATP. So stimulation for the electron transport chain, we have NADH from the TCA cycle. We also have ADP down here. If there's a high amount of ADP, that's going to provide a lot of substrate for these hydrogen ions to come through and help create the ATP that's needed. So that's going to stimulate this process. Now, things that we need to help it along, we need FAD2H, also from the TCA cycle. We need iron in here. We also need CoQ10, very important step. We need oxygen as well. So you got to make sure you're getting your oxygen into your cells so they can be used in this step. So again, we have iron. We're going to want some antioxidant activity to help this run smoothly. Now, inhibition of this process, high ATP down here will build up and say to this ATP synthase, hey, chill out, we're good right now. We don't need to keep doing this. Now, also this process can be inhibited by a lack of any of these things. CoQ10 is a big one, or iron, or copper, or oxygen. They will inhibit this process, make it not go so smoothly. That's not what we want. Now, in the fasting state, this all is still ideally going to be happening because of the NADH from the TCA cycle, which is still going on in the fasting state. It's not necessarily from dietary glucose that we're getting this energy, but other things going into glycolysis, going into the TCA cycle, coming out into the ETC as NADH and continuing this energy production. One quick note, cyanide or other chemical inhibitors can inhibit some of these reactions. So that's one of the reasons, or that is the reason cyanide is so deadly, because it stops this, you can't make energy, and you die pretty quickly.